except to begin some comments on the instructions for doing the word studies. So you should find in the Papali a couple of things dealing with words. If you can pull up the word study instructions, I'll make some comments on that to get you started on the project. But I've begun by saying in our belief in verbal inspiration, while we believe that every single word inspired by God, given by God, it is not in individual words that we comprehend truth. Truth is propositional. The truth is propositional. It is communicated in statements, not in isolated words. If that were the case, then all the Lord would have to do would to be give us a list of words in alphabetical order. But that's not the way the Scriptures revealed to us. We have those words that are placed in propositions. And it is in the propositions then that we have the communication of revelation of God's truth to us. But in that proposition, we have to understand what each of the particular words are, what the meanings of those words are. And there is a hierarchy here, certainly as we look at the nature of communication. When we talk about the proposition, all right, there's the proposition. That's where we have the communication of truth. But that proposition is a combination of words. We understand that. But what is a word? All right, what do we mean by a word? What is a word? A word is a symbol. All right, a word is a symbol. It's either a set of graphemes if I'm writing or a set of phonemes if I'm speaking. But what is it, I say, that constitutes a word? A word is a symbol, so here we have the word, the symbol, and I hear that word, I hear that symbol, and it creates a concept. All right, that generates a concept in my head. I hear it, I read it, it makes me think of something. And as I think of that something, that concept, then that concept directs me to what we refer to as the referent in the real world. What is it that we're talking about? But it's not a direct relationship, as it were, between the word, the symbol, and the referent. It generates the concept, and then that concept directs us to the referent, what it is that we are actually talking about in the real world, whether it's an object, whether it's an event, whether it's a circumstance, what have you. And those concepts then, the definition that is suggested by that word is comprised of what we refer to as components. The components of meaning. What are the components that combine to form the meaning to give the definition of a given word? And when we do a word study, I'm saying all that to say this, as we're dealing with a word study, doing a word study, particularly of those key theological words, those words that in the Scripture are charged, if you will. There are certain theological buzzwords, if you will, that I want to be able to understand and to define. What are their components? What is it that combines to give the meaning of that word that brings us then to the referent in the real world, what it is that we are actually talking about? And to identify that really is what constitutes what we typically refer to as a word study. And that's what I want us to be engaged in here. So I'm looking for the meaning of a word. I'm looking for the meaning of a word. Now, what is it that dictates, or what is it that reveals the meaning of a word? How do we know what a word means? How do we know what a word means? We say, oh, you look in a dictionary. All right, fine. That just puts the question back one more generation as it were. How do they know what the word means? All right, how do they know what the word means? How do we know the meaning of words? And the bottom line is it's usage. All right, it's the usage of a word. It's the usage of a word that reveals to us, determines then for us what that word means. So if I'm doing a word study, the very first thing that I want to identify the very first thing that I want to do is to locate where that word is used. All right, we locate where that word is going to be used. The unhappy thing is that most people, a lot of people, will do a word study, and the first thing they go to is Kittle's Theological Dictionary or whatever. It's not the place to start. As a factor toward the end of the project, perhaps, but it's not where I want to start. If we're doing a word study, we're doing our original investigation here, as it were, trying to learn that methodology. We want to find out where the word occurs. So if I'm doing a word study, the best friend that I have is a concordance. All right, have a concordance. Now, you have English concordances, Strong's and Young's and whatever, and those can be helpful. The standard Greek concordance is going to be Moulton and Gieden. The standard Hebrew concordance for at least doing word studies will be Lazowski. And you should be familiar with these particular tools. So in the particular word that you are doing, whatever word you've chosen, the first thing that you want to do is to identify, locate where that word occurs in the Old Testament, or if you're doing a New Testament word, in the New Testament, where that word occurs. Now, I'm old school, all right? I'm old school. I love Lazowski for Hebrew word studies. I love Moulton and Gieden for New Testament word studies. But I realize that some of you have on your computer there Logos or Concordance or BibleWorks or whatever that can do that by the click of a button. Feel free, all right? Feel free to identify the locations of the words that way. I don't care how you do it, all right? I don't care how you do it. But the first step is to identify the places where that word occurs. And then we look at the context. We look at the context, and I want to look at aspects of syntax. All right, we want to look at aspects of syntax. What are the grammatical settings of that word? Part of that is, what part of speech is it? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? Is it an adjective? The part of speech that it has is going to have some play in the way in which I understand that word to occur. If it's a verb, is it a transitive verb? Is it intransitive? All of these syntactical relationships or syntagmic relationships, we sometimes will say the relationship that those words are going to have grammatically. And the other thing that we look at, I'm going to give you a word, I don't know if you know this word or not. You know the word semotaxis? What do I mean by semotaxis? Semotaxis simply refers to the environment in which a word occurs. All right, semotaxis is the environment in which a word occurs. And in many ways, words are like people, all right, in the sense that I can tell a lot about people by who they hang out with, all right? I can look at your friends and I can look at your associates, and that tells me something about you. And words are the same way. I can learn a lot about words by their environment, who they hang out with, what kind of context, what kind of circumstances, if you will that word occur, and that will tell me a lot. So I want to look at the syntax, part of speech, grammatical relationships, but also the semotaxis. I'll often refer to this as the associative field. The associative field in which that word occurs. Is it a bad context? Is it a good context? If it's a verb, what kind of subjects does it take? Is it always God? We'll take an example. Here's the word bara. All right, you know bara, to create. I can make the statement theologically. That creation is divinely, a uniquely divine activity. All right? I can make the statement theologically that creation is a uniquely divine activity. Now, what gives me the right to say that? Because I read it in a systematic theology book? Well, maybe I did. But where do they get it? All right? we go to bara and we look at the occurrences. And the interesting thing about bara is that the agent of bara, every time it occurs in the Scripture, is God. All right? Man is never the object, or man is never the subject of that word, unless it's passive, but still God is the agent. So on the basis of the syntactical relationships there, the nature of the subjects, I can make then a theological conclusion about that particular word. So pay attention to the syntax, paying attention to the semotactic markings, the environment in which it occurs. I'm going to illustrate for you here the word Sheol. All right, the word Sheol. Well, it doesn't take much observation to realize that Sheol occurs in the context of death. Right? It doesn't take much observation to see that Sheol is very often associated with things that are downward, that things that are dark. All right, so that's part of the associative field that's going to give me a flavor, if you will, as to what that word and how that word is being used. So we collect the references. All right, we collect the references, and we start then to make a list. Can we begin to classify? Can we begin to classify? So you collect. All right, the first step is you collect the data, and then you try to classify. You classify the data based upon your observations. All right, you look at that, or here's a bunch of occurrences that occur with this idea or with that idea, and you start to group. Your word is going to dictate that, so I'm not going to be specific, but can you start to group? Can you start to classify in different categories how that word indeed may be used? Then you make a list of those with particular illustrative references. All right, now you reorganize then. You reorganize the data. I'm grouping all of these references here, all of these references here. These are just the notes and the kind of study that you're doing, I say, for yourself. Have clear passages that will illustrate each of those particular senses. All right, so you're collecting the data. Now, after you collect the data, and after you start to make your own conclusions here about where this word is going and the environment in which it occurs, at that point, then look at some of the word study books. All right, and there are many helpful books out there. You have the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. You have Westerman and Yeni. You have the Old Testament Theological and Exegesis Dictionary. Many, many places where you can look to get to find out what other people are saying. But I want to stress, please, that you don't look at those until the end, all right? Until you've already looked at the evidence. Because if you look at all of those word study books first, it's going to jaundice everything else that you see. You're going to say, who am I? All right, who am I? That's in print. It's in print. It must be right. And it's going to influence everything and how you view the word. No. You look at the evidence so that you can evaluate what they are saying. And it very well may be that say, oh yeah, that's how that fits, and they can give you some insight. Or you can blow off what they're saying. If I started looking, for instance, I said I'm going to do Sheol for you. If I looked at the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament on Sheol before I ever did any study, I would not argue the way I'm going to argue about what that word means, because they take it a different way in some parts. And I think they're wrong in some of their analysis. So, but I do want to look at those. All right, take a look at those and see if there's something that you have missed in your particular analysis. All right, now when you write the paper, I've given on the bottom of that page the procedure of paper. It's only 2 pages. All right, I'm only asking for 2 pages. And you can tell me everything I want to know about a word in 2 pages. All right? Not looking for a long paper, but if you do what I'm asking you to do here, it's going to be a nice, concise, and clear definition of what that word means. I've given to you here in 4 paragraphs. Let's go through this point by point. In the first paragraph, note the most frequent glosses used for the word in the AV. You know what I mean by a gloss, all right? A gloss is the word for us in English that is typically used to represent that word in Hebrew. So let's again just go back to Sheol here. Sheol in the Authorized Version is glossed, translated, if you will, but I like to use the word gloss here. It is glossed with the word hell, with the word grave, and with the word pit. All right, it's translated those three different ways. It's glossed those three different ways. So in the very first sentence almost, as you identify whatever your particular word is, just make the notation that in the King James Version, the Authorized Version, this word is typically glossed as blank, blank, blank. Right? Maybe it's the same way all the time. Maybe it's going to be different. And again, this is going to be very helpful, particularly as you try to answer questions for people. I don't know how many times people have come to me with their Bible open with a question. What does this verse mean? And say, all right, I know what that word is, you see. I know how the AV typically translates that word. This is the word, and then we can begin our answer of that question. So that's the first piece of information. Note the most frequent glosses for the word in the AV. Also in this paragraph, comment on the associative field. That is the environment in which the word occurs. So you don't have to be, in great detail here. I want some references to illustrate. So I would say, Sheol is very often associated with darkness. All right, and I put a reference there where that would be the case. It's associated with a downward, all right, so there's another associative field, put it there. It's associated with death and other words. Any synonyms, all right, any synonyms or any antonyms that may occur with a word is going to be very, very helpful. All right, begin at words, the environment, who the word hangs out with is going to be instructive for us. So in the first paragraph, I'm giving the basic glosses of that word. We find it in the Authorized Version, and then some general statements, broad statements concerning the associative field, the semotaxis, what are the semotactic markings, environment in which that word occurs. That's all I want in the first paragraph. In the second paragraph, I want you to explicitly state the senses of the word. Now, when I say the sense of the word, I mean the definition of the word. When I say the sense of a word, I'm talking about the definition of a word. So let's go back to Sheol. I said that Sheol is typically glossed in the Authorized Version as hell, as grave, as pit. I come now to define the word. I would not define the word. I would not say Sheol means grave or hell or pit. All right, that's not a definition. All right, that's not that's the gloss. That's the gloss. What do we mean by the grave? What do we mean by hell? What do we mean by the pit, if that's how we want to do it? And it may not be. All right, and we want to get rid of the mindset here. It may not be that the senses that we state of the word are going to equal in the number of glosses that may be used to translate that particular word. So when I say the senses of the word, I mean the definition. I want you to create a definition of the word. The definition of the word is the combination of the components that combine to give the meaning of that word. Lexicons tend not to do that for us. All right, what do lexicons do? They give you the gloss. All right, they give you a gloss. With the exception, and I'd like to see this happening in Hebrew. There's nothing really available in Hebrew like this. Are you familiar with Lo and Nida, Greek lexicon? A whole different approach, and I like the way because they're attempted definitions. All right, they have their different word domains. You look up the words, all Greek. This is just Greek stuff. You can look up the domain, look up the word, and it attempts to give a definition and not just a gloss. Fear. How would you define fear? Fear is an emotion that is generated by something scary external. I just made that up, okay? Component. Fear is an emotion. It's a component. Every word is going to be either a thing, an event, an abstract, or relationship. So it's an affection, it's an emotion, right? It's an emotion. It's caused, it's generated by something scary, right? It paralyzed. However, I'm combining these things to form a definition, all right? So for Sheol, the grave, for that sense, and I think there is a sense in which it refers to the grave, I would define it as the place. Sheol, sense number one, is where the body rots, the place where the body rots, the place where the body corrupts, okay? Not describing what kind of grave, but it's the place where the body rots. Sometimes even it's on the top of the earth. On the top of the earth, there are those that are slain. They're left there on the surface of the ground to rot. That's their Sheol, you see. As far as Jonah was concerned, his grave was what? Belly of a fish, right? So it's the place where the body rots. That's the definition. For hell, that's not the definition, that's a gloss. We'll see that Sheol, in that sense, is the abode of departed wicked spirits, incorporating all of that. So I'm looking for a definition, all right? So you will say then, in the second paragraph, the blank word has two senses, it has three senses, maybe four senses, I don't know, whatever you discover here. And then you will list those senses, giving a definition, and then making a comparison. Make a comparison, a brief comparison with the English. Are the English words more general or specific than the Hebrew or the Greek word? Do the English glosses create the same response in the English reader as the Hebrew word created for the Hebrew or the Greek reader? Does it? You're going to find that some words in Hebrew are more specific than the corresponding word that is glossed in English. Sheol again. If I say hell, right? In English, that conjures up a particular idea, right? Conjures a particular idea. Is hell more specific or general? How does that relate to the Hebrew word Sheol? I say we'll talk about that in due course. What's another word here? Nephesh. Nephesh. Typically translated in English as how? Soul. Soul. But I guarantee you, when you hear the word soul, what do you think of almost immediately? The immaterial part of man, all right? The immaterial part of man. But you're going to find that nephesh, and I'll talk about nephesh here also, nephesh refers to the entirety of man. It refers to the entirety of man. And sometimes when it's translated as soul, you see, in English, we immediately think of that immaterial part, when in reality it's referring to the entirety of man's being. Sometimes it becomes equated with the idea of person. You see that very often when God speaks and God says, my soul abhors, or my soul loves, or something. You know, God says that. Does God have a soul? God is without body parts, and right, he's a spirit. So God does not have a soul as we think of a soul, but God is a person, right? God is a person. And so when God says, my soul abhors, or my soul hates, what's he saying? I hate, all right? The whole person. So there's a situation where the English is far more specific, all right? The typical English translation is far more specific than the Hebrew word, which is a more general word. So make those observations as you can. Does the English glosses create the same kind of response, same ideas, that more specific, more general than we have? Okay. Number 3 paragraph. In the third paragraph, give clear references to illustrate the senses of the word. All right, you say this word's got 3 senses. All right, give me some clear, concise, and examples. Now, you're not going to give me every single reference. Some of the words that you are looking at occur hundreds of times in the Old Testament. You're not going to give me every single reference. But in the data that you have collected, are there some expressly clear texts that illustrate why you want to define the word in the way you have? Here's this sense. Here's a text that illustrates. And now you make your point. You don't have to spell everything out, but you need to explain how now this sense gives understanding to that particular idea. And I would suggest that in that paragraph, as you're illustrating the senses, that you stay away from theologically charged or controversial passages. All right? As soon as you get into a theological passage, we've got other factors that want to kick in for us, right? Besides just the evidence of that word. So if possible, stay with just non-controversial, non-theological passages to illustrate. Then in the final paragraph, I want you to select at least one, no more than two, theological texts where now my understanding of this word gives an interpretation that I may not otherwise see from the typical English translation. So now in the final paragraph, you're finding a key theological word, reference, example. Now plugging in the information of the word. So if I were dealing with Sheol, I probably would jump on Psalm 16, you see. I would jump on Psalm 16, verse 10 there, right? You'll not leave my soul in hell, all right, where the Authorized Version translates it. What does that mean? I think of hell there. We think of hell, place of fire, brimstone, whatever. See? But the New Testament even uses that passage to prove what? The bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. All right? It's a text that the New Testament tells me refers to the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. You'll not leave my soul in hell. And Nephesh plays into that as well, right? You'll not leave my soul. You'll not leave. Typically, you're going to find that whenever you have a pronominal suffix on the word soul, it's the equation of a personal pronoun. So my soul is tantamount to what? Me. You will not leave me in Sheol. Where was Christ resurrected from? From the grave. You see. All right, so here now is my understanding of this word that can be plugged into a theological context. Theological verse that gives a whole different, or perhaps a different insight into that word. Okay? That's all I'm looking for. All right? That's all I'm looking for. Any questions? Yes, sir.
If we have 200 to 300 instances of a word, we run the risk of missing something that's important that would change our...
You survey. Here you want to rely on the lexicon, all right, to help classify things. Now, I know that when you see a lot of references, it's kind of intimidating. But after all is said and done, the more references I have, the more occurrences I have of a word, the more assurance I can have that I'm coming to the meaning of that word, all right? Because it's usage. So the more usages that I have, the more confidence I can have that I've made the right assessments. It appears intimidating at first, right? But if I have a word that only occurs 5 times, I'm looking for usage then to determine. And often those 5 occurrences are in the same chapter, if they're that. Now we have to factor in some other issues. Yeah. So, but you use your classification, even take the classification of Brown, Driver, and Briggs or something. Yeah, that'll get you started.
With the last point, to illustrate our point, can we connect to New Testament to
If I have a New Testament that factors in, now certainly if I were dealing with Psalm 16, I'm going to play on the apostolic interpretation, which tells me I'm right, you see. Because there's, the inspired interpretation. So if I have that, sure, but you're not going to always have necessarily a New Testament counterpart for it. But if it's there, sure, go for it.
The difference between 1 and 2 as regards to glosses and senses.
Yes. The gloss, when I say gloss, that is simply how the word is represented in in the other language. All right, so let's take the word. Let's see. Well, we'll just take the word bin. Sun. All right. What does bin mean? Well, we'll figure that out, but it's typically glossed with that English word. All right? So the gloss is the way it's translated in a particular language. All right? But that's not the definition. All right? Sun is not the definition of that word. If you tell me that bin means sun, all you're telling me is that I translate bin as sun. All right? What does that mean? All right? What does that mean? Not a great example, but what does that mean? So Sheol is glossed, hell, grave, pit. Fine, that's how it's glossed, but what do we mean by that? All right, what do we mean by that? So in the first paragraph, I'm simply identifying the typical way it's, if you don't like the word gloss, how it's translated. But gloss is the technical word here. All right, might as well learn the technical words. How it's glossed, all right, how it's glossed. And once I see that in my English Bible, then here's, if I can train myself to know what those typical glosses are, I can answer a lot of questions without having to run to my office to find my Hebrew Bible, you see. Okay. So in paragraph 2, then that's where I want the definition. All right. That's where I want to try to expand this into a definition, which may not necessarily correspond to each of the glosses. You see.
If we have a word that the English gloss also is the gloss for many other Hebrew words, do you want us to include those other Hebrew words in our...
That would be part of it, yeah, because that's, part of how I will identify a word is the associative field, all right? So if this word is hanging out, so how can I do, if I'm doing emeth, you see, truth. I've got to consider some other words as well that is going to be connected, and hesed. I think somebody's doing hesed. Who's doing hesed? You're doing hesed. Yeah. There's a word that you wish you could just say hesed and everybody gets the whole concept, right? It's a beautiful word. But how is it translated? It's translated mercy. It's translated loving kindness. It's translated kindness. It's translated tender mercies. But so is rahem, you see, translated the same way oftentimes. And those words will be in similar context. So yeah, I would want to note that. Okay? All right, any questions? All right, that'll get you started, and then once you get started, if you have questions concerning the methodology or where to go, please feel free to contact me, and we'll go from there. Now, I want to talk with you then a little bit here about biblical semantics and biblical theology. How does biblical semantics play in to the study of theology? And I want to begin by reading a paragraph for you. I want you to listen carefully to what I'm going to read, and then I want your assessment. This is from James Barr, but listen to what it says. It is the special use of ecclesia in the Septuagint that gives the New Testament its technical term for the church. Behind the Greek ecclesia, there lies the Hebrew kahal. The fact that kahal comes from the same root as kol, the word for voice, suggests that the Old Testament kahal was the community summoned by the divine voice by the Word of God. of that ecclesia is a very apt translation, indicating as it does the community as the called, the kletoi of God. Ecclesia is church, not in any sociological or political sense of assembly, and not therefore in any sociological or political continuity with Israel. It is church as an act of God, as the community called into being and created by God's Word. In line with that is the fact that the Old Testament kahal was first established at Sinai when God came and spoke and His Word founded the covenant community. And so kahal came to have a special significance as the community brought into covenant relationship with God for sacrifice and worship, and for the special end of revelation. Kahal denotes the Old Testament church actively engaged in God's purposes of revelation and salvation. Okay? It's talking about the word ecclesia and relating that to the Hebrew word kahal, ecclesia, church, called out, playing upon that root from kaleo, relating kahal, congregation, assembly, to kol. Okay? What is your reactions? Any response? How would you evaluate that statement? Not everybody at once, please. We have to keep things decently in order here. Right?
So he's saying that the church is not started in the New Testament, but it is started in the Old Testament.
That's in part what he's saying, but that's not the issue really that I want to focus on particularly. He's defining this as the called out body, right? Called out body. And he's seeing the same connection to the kahal kol in the Old Testament. Question, is that a legitimate analysis or no? Now, you may like or dislike his conclusions. All right, let's forget about the conclusions here. But as far as the argumentation, is that legit? Or is it not legit? Is that the proper way of handling words or not?
In my mind, it could be, except it seems so based on the phonetic aspect of it that, I don't know, it doesn't strike me as consistent.
Okay. He's obviously playing upon the root connections. He's playing upon the what we might refer to as the etymological connections of the word. Now, there's no question, all right, if I'm going to look at the word ecclesia, there's no question that it's a compound word. It's a compound word from the Greek preposition ek, out of, and it's the passive of kaleo, to call. The church is the called out body. I have heard sermons in my relatively short life. I have heard sermons on the church playing on ecclesia, called out. I've heard sermons on election, called out, elect. Do I believe in election? I do. I do. I have heard sermons on the theme of the church's separation from the world. We're called out of the world. Do I believe in a holy lifestyle? I do. I do. But my theology of the church, and here's my point, the theology of the church does not depend on the spelling of ecclesia. And my views of separation does not depend on the spelling of ecclesia. In one way, the fact that church is from ek and kaleo, called out, to its meaning is irrelevant. It really is. Connection, we can maybe see some. But it's the usage. It's the usage. I have a hard time, you see, if I'm going to argue that the whole ecclesiology that we must understand is based on the spelling of that word, I've got real problem in Acts when here's a mob that is gathered together to run Paul out of town. Is called what? Ecclesia. All right? It's ecclesia. And it's a mob. All right? It's a mob, hardly the elect of God. So I say we need to be careful. And in taking the word kahal and relating it to coal. Yeah, there's a kof and there's a lamed, but you're going to be hard-pressed to see a connection between the hey and the wow historically. But it's close enough. All right, now it raises the question. All right, it raised the question. Biblical theology has had a long tendency to base certain intricate theological points on the etymology of words, or the existence of certain words in a given language based on etymology. Is that legitimate? So I want to talk really, in setting this up, biblical semantics and Old Testament or biblical theology, by looking at two subject matters. And my time is going to be gone, and I was told I have to quit on time. Two subject matters. I want to talk about etymology. Where is it that etymology, is the study of etymology, whatever that means, is the study of etymology significant or no? What part does it play? And then the second issue that I want to address with you is the relationship between language and thought. The relationship between language and thought. And this raises up a whole issue that I think we need to very well understand. So I want to talk about etymology. The word, what do we mean by etymology even? Word history, right? The history of a word, yeah, that's part of it. The component parts of a word, the root connections of a word. Part of the difficulty is defining even what etymology means. But there's so much, there's so much that we're going to see done in terms of word studies that are based upon these supposed etymological connections. And my premise is going to be that etymology in and of itself is not a guide to the meaning of a word. All right? Etymology by itself is not a guide to the meaning of a word. There may be a connection sometimes. Words may be transparent at times. Or they may be opaque. You know what I mean by a transparent word. A transparent word is one that has something about its spelling, something about its sound that suggests the meaning of the word. An opaque word is one that you just have to scratch your head and wonder why do they call that what they call it, all right? But given our nature, in our inquisitiveness, right, in our desire to know why, we like to assume as much as we can transparency. See, if I can figure out why that word is spelled that way, tend to give us some degree of satisfaction. All right, we have to quit, but we'll come to this. You can get started. I wanted to make sure to cover the procedure. You can get started on your word study, and next time I'll try to deal with this particular issue of etymology. Where does that fit? How does it fit? And then the concept, I say, between language and thought. Okay, let's pray. Our gracious Lord, we again give our thanks for the opportunity we have to study it together. We would pray, Lord, that as we deal with these methods and these issues before us, that these men might learn skills that will do them good in their ministries. Let this be helpful. Let us learn not only methodology, but let us learn, Lord, what can be learned from the actual words here that we evaluate together. So bless to that.